October 14th, 1943. 20,000 feet above Germany, Lieutenant Howard Hertz watched his fuel gauge needle drop below the red line and knew what was coming. His squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts had escorted the B-17 flying fortresses as far as Aachen, right to the limit of their range, and now physics was making the call. Turn back or fall out of the sky. The bomber crews called the escorts their little friends. But at 14:30 hours on what would become known as Black Thursday, those friends were abandoning them 400 miles from home. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Through his canopy, Hertz could see the bomber stream continuing east toward Schweinfurt, a city whose name would haunt the 8th Air Force for the rest of the war. And beyond the bombers, barely visible in the October haze, he could see them. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, dozens of them, orbiting like sharks, waiting. The Luftwaffe pilots knew the math as well as Hertz did. Once the American fighters turned for home, the bombers were theirs. Hertz banked hard to the west, his wingman tight on his right. Behind them, the first German fighters were already diving on the bomber formation. By nightfall, 60 B-17s would be scattered across German countryside in burning wreckage. Another 17 would limp back to England so badly damaged they'd never fly again. 600 American airmen dead, wounded, or captured. 26% casualties. The mathematics of aerial warfare had just delivered an unambiguous verdict on American strategic bombing doctrine. Without fighter escorts that could go the distance, daylight raids over Germany were suicide. The problem wasn't courage. The 8th Air Force had plenty of men willing to die. The problem was physics. The B-17 carried enough fuel to reach Berlin and return. The fighters protecting them did not. Every American fighter in the European theatre in October 1943 faced the same fundamental limitation: range. The P-38 Lightning could escort bombers about 300 miles into Germany, the P-47 Thunderbolt, maybe 350 on a good day. Berlin sat 450 miles from the English coast. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, the oil refineries at Ploiesti, the aircraft plants at Regensburg, all beyond reach of friendly fighters. German commanders understood the gap and exploited it ruthlessly. Luftwaffe doctrine in late 1943 called for patience. Let the American escorts waste fuel chasing decoy fighters near the coast. Wait until the P-38s and P-47s hit bingo fuel and turned for home. Then launch the real attack. 350 German fighters had participated in the Schweinfurt massacre. They'd had unlimited time to coordinate, reload, refuel, and hit the bomber streams again and again. The B-17's defensive guns meant nothing when the enemy had 3 hours of uncontested hunting time. In Washington, General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, faced a crisis that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign. The 8th Air Force had been built on a premise that was proving catastrophically wrong, that heavily armed bombers flying in tight formation could defend themselves. After Schweinfurt, that premise was dead. But abandoning daylight precision bombing meant abandoning the fundamental doctrine that justified an independent air force. The British had already tried daylight raids and switched to night bombing after suffering unbearable losses. If America did the same, it would validate British skepticism about American air power doctrine and possibly end Arnold's dreams of an independent United States Air Force after the war. The alternative was finding a way to escort the bombers all the way to the target and back, which meant a fighter with range capabilities that didn't exist. Not in the American arsenal, not in anyone's arsenal, except there was one aircraft that nobody was paying attention to, a fighter that had been flying combat missions with the Royal Air Force since April 1942, a plane that American procurement officers had dismissed as unsuitable for high-altitude combat, a design that Army Air Forces brass kept trying to ignore, even as reports from England suggested it might be exactly what they needed. The North American P-51 Mustang, and the reason it could do what no other fighter could came down to a decision one engineer made in April 1940 that everyone told him was stupid. Instead of putting fuel tanks in the fuselage like every other fighter designer in the world, Edgar Schmued put them in the wings. The fuel system that would eventually let American fighters escort bombers to Berlin and back started with an argument about where to put the gas. Spring 1940. North American Aviation's engineering department in Inglewood, California, was working on deadline. The British Purchasing Commission had given them an impossible timeline: design and build a prototype fighter in 120 days. The British were desperate for aircraft. German Bf-109s were chewing through RAF fighters over France and the Low Countries. Britain needed modern fighters in quantity, and they needed them fast. They'd approached North American about building Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license, but the company's president, Dutch Kindleberger, and his chief engineer, Edgar Schmued, had a different idea. Don't build someone else's obsolete fighter. Build something better. Schmued was 41 years old, a German-born engineer who'd immigrated to the United States via Brazil. He'd spent 15 years designing aircraft, first at Fokker, then at North American. He understood aerodynamics, structural engineering, and the brutal economics of wartime production. When Kindleberger gave him the green light to design a new fighter, Schmued already had clear ideas about what wouldn't work. The P-40 had its fuel tanks in the fuselage, directly behind the pilot. Standard practice for American fighters. The Allison-engined P-39 carried its fuel the same way. So did the Seversky P-35 and the Curtiss Hawk 75. Conventional wisdom said fuselage tanks made sense. They sat close to the center of gravity. They were easy to access for maintenance, and they kept fuel weight centralized, which simplified flight dynamics. But Schmued had been studying fuel systems in long-range aircraft, and he'd noticed something about putting fuel in the fuselage. It limited how much you could carry. The fuselage had to accommodate the pilot, the engine, the guns, the ammunition, the radio equipment, the oxygen system, and all the other hardware that made a fighter functional. Whatever space remained could hold fuel. In the P-40, that meant about 120 gallons, maybe 160 if you really pushed it, which gave the aircraft a combat radius of maybe 300 miles. Fine for local air defense, useless for escort duty. Schmued proposed something radical. Move the primary fuel tanks out of the fuselage entirely. Put them in the wings, between the front and rear spars, in the space that most fighters used for ammunition storage. The idea triggered immediate pushback from his own engineering team. Fuel in the wings meant running fuel lines through the wing structure. More complexity, more potential leak points, more weight. It meant the fuel system would be more vulnerable to combat damage. One cannon shell through the wing and you'd lose a fuel tank. It meant the aircraft's weight distribution would change dramatically as fuel burned off, potentially causing handling problems. And it meant redesigning the ammunition storage to fit around the wing tanks, which added more complexity to an already tight schedule. Schmued's response to every objection was the same. Look at the total fuel capacity. In the Mustang's wing design, which used NACA's new laminar flow airfoil profile, there was substantial internal volume between the spars. Schmued calculated that he could fit 92 gallons in each wing, 184 gallons total. That was 50% more fuel than the P-40 carried, and he hadn't even touched the fuselage yet. If they needed to add more capacity later, they could put an additional tank behind the pilot. But the wing tanks would be the foundation, self-sealing, protected by the wing's structural strength, and located in spaces that would otherwise go largely unused. The weight distribution concern was real, but manageable. The wings sat close to the aircraft's center of gravity. As fuel burned off, the weight decrease would be gradual and predictable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Pilots could burn fuel strategically, using wing tanks first to keep the center of gravity stable. The vulnerability argument didn't hold up under scrutiny either. Every fighter had vulnerable fuel systems. At least wing tanks put the fuel outside the cockpit. A fuselage tank fire meant the pilot was sitting directly in front of a potential inferno. Wing tank fires could be survivable if the pilot reacted quickly and the self-sealing systems worked. Most critically, the wing tank design gave the Mustang something no American fighter had: growth potential. The prototype flew on October 26, 1940, exactly 102 days after contract signing. The British designated it the Mustang Mark I. Initial performance tests showed exactly what Schmued had predicted. With 184 gallons of internal fuel, the Mustang had a combat range of roughly 750 miles. Not revolutionary, but respectable. Better than any single-engine American fighter in service. But there was a problem that had nothing to do with fuel capacity. The Allison V1710 engine lost power rapidly above 15,000 feet. The Mustang was fast and maneuverable at low altitude, but combat over Europe was happening at 25,000 feet and higher, where the Allison-equipped Mustang couldn't compete. The RAF used their early Mustangs for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack. Valuable work, but not the high-altitude escort mission the war was demanding. The aircraft's potential remained locked behind an engine limitation, until someone suggested trying a different power plant. Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronnie Harker flew a Mustang in April 1942 and immediately recognized what it could become with the right engine. Rolls-Royce was producing the Merlin 61, a two-stage supercharged V12 that maintained power output to 40,000 feet. The British fitted a Merlin to a Mustang airframe. The aircraft that emerged from that modification was a different machine. Top speed jumped from 390 miles per hour to 433. Service ceiling nearly doubled. Rate of climb increased from 2,000 to over 3,000 feet per minute, and critically, that 750-mile range with internal fuel only remained unchanged. In the United States, North American aviation quickly followed the British lead. By November 1942, they were testing their own Merlin-powered Mustang variant, designated XP-51B. The Packard Motor Company was already manufacturing Merlins under license for American use. Production of the P-51B began in June 1943. Army Air Forces procurement officers finally started paying attention. The P-51B, with internal fuel only, could escort bombers roughly as far as a P-47 with external drop tanks. And the P-51B hadn't even started using drop tanks yet. But 750 miles still wasn't enough. Berlin was 900 miles from English bases, round trip. Schweinfurt was 800. Ploiesti was over 1,000 from Italian bases. The Mustang was closer to solving the escort problem than any other fighter. But closer still meant bomber crews were dying without protection over the deepest targets in Germany. What happened next came from an unlikely source, a directive that almost nobody wanted to follow. In July 1943, right as the Schweinfurt disaster was approaching, the Army Air Forces issued an order to all fighter manufacturers. Maximize internal fuel capacity. Find ways to add more fuel without compromising performance. Most manufacturers looked at that directive and saw an impossible request. You couldn't just add fuel tanks to an aircraft that was already in production. The weight distribution would be wrong. The center of gravity would shift. The aircraft would become unstable, maybe unflyable. But Schmued's wing tank design had left the P-51's fuselage relatively uncluttered. There was space behind the pilot, between the cockpit and the tail section. North Americans' engineers calculated the numbers. The Merlin engine mounted further forward than the Allison had, which moved the aircraft's center of gravity slightly forward. That created a margin, a space where you could add weight without catastrophically destabilizing the airplane. They could fit an 85-gallon tank in the rear fuselage. 85 gallons plus the 184 in the wings meant 269 gallons of internal fuel. Add 2 external 75-gallon drop tanks under the wings, and you were carrying 419 gallons total. Later variants would carry even larger 110-gallon drop tanks, pushing total capacity to 489 gallons. The math was straightforward. A Merlin engine at cruise power burned roughly 70 gallons per hour. 489 gallons meant 7 hours of flight time, minus combat reserves. That translated to roughly 1,600 miles of operational range. 1,600 miles. Berlin was 1,400 miles round trip from England. Schweinfurt, 1,200. Suddenly, every major target in Germany was reachable with escort coverage from takeoff to landing. But the 85-gallon fuselage tank created a new problem, one that would kill pilots if it wasn't understood. With a full fuselage tank, the P-51B didn't fly like an airplane. It flew like a brick with wings. The problem was center of gravity. That 85 gallons of fuel weighed over 500 pounds, sitting well behind the pilot. When the tank was full, the aircraft's center of gravity shifted dramatically aft, creating what test pilots described as extremely unstable longitudinal characteristics. Translation: try to pull hard on the stick, and the aircraft would snap into a violent stall or enter a spin with almost no warning. The Army Air Force's test report from April 1943 was brutally direct. With the internal fuselage tank filled with 85 gallons of fuel, the airplane is so unstable longitudinally that violent pullouts or tight turns must be executed with caution as stick loads rapidly reverse. Stick loads rapidly reverse. That meant, in a hard turn, the control stick would suddenly go light in your hands and the nose would snap upward uncontrollably. In combat, that reversal would kill you. A P-51 pilot encountering a Messerschmitt Bf-109 while carrying a full fuselage tank couldn't fight. He couldn't turn hard, couldn't pull high-G maneuvers, couldn't do anything that might trigger that instability. The Bf-109 pilot would see the Mustang's sluggish response and exploit it immediately. One burst from the Germans' 30mm cannon and the war was over. The solution was doctrine, not engineering. Pilots were instructed to burn the fuselage tank first before entering combat airspace. Take off from England, climb to altitude, head toward Germany, and use that rear tank during the cruise phase when you weren't maneuvering hard. By the time you reached the escort rendezvous point, the fuselage tank would be mostly empty. The aircraft would be stable again, responsive, ready to fight. It was a compromise, but it worked. The operational planning became precise. Fuel from the fuselage tank during the first 90 minutes of flight. Burn it off entirely before encountering enemy fighters. Once the fuselage tank was empty, switch to wing tanks. Fight the mission. On the way home, drop the external tanks if you needed the performance boost. The wing tanks had enough fuel to get you back to England. Pilots adapted quickly. Everyone understood the risk. A green replacement pilot who didn't burn his fuselage tank before combat wouldn't survive his first encounter with the Luftwaffe. Veterans made sure the new guys understood. Use the rear tank during cruise. Never enter combat with it full. Follow that rule and the P-51 would take you to Berlin and bring you home. Violate it, and you die over Belgium because your airplane wouldn't turn when you needed it to. December 1943. The first P-51Bs equipped with the 85-gallon fuselage tanks reached England. The 8th Air Force was still reeling from Schweinfurt. Bomber losses had forced a pause in deep penetration raids. Crews were being rebuilt. Doctrine was being reconsidered. And into that moment of crisis arrived an aircraft that could finally solve the escort problem. The 354th Fighter Group, equipped with P-51Bs, flew their first long-range escort mission on December 5, 1943. Target: Amiens, France. Nothing deep into Germany yet. The 8th Air Force brass wanted to verify the Mustang could actually do what North American claimed. The mission went flawlessly. The P-51Bs escorted the bombers to the target, maintained station during the bomb run, fought off Luftwaffe interceptors, and returned to England with fuel to spare. Bomber losses: minimal. Fighter losses: 0. On December 13th, the 354th went deeper. Bremen, Germany. 300 miles from the English coast. Still within range of P-47s and P-38s, but this time the Mustangs stayed with the bombers longer, providing continuous coverage through the most dangerous parts of the mission. Again, minimal losses. On December 20th, the mission that changed everything. Target. Bremen again, but this time weather scattered the P-47 escorts. The Mustangs flew the entire mission essentially alone, protecting the bomber stream from the coast to the target and back. 400 miles round trip, the Luftwaffe put up over 100 fighters. The Mustangs tore through them. Captain Don Botchke of the 354th shot down 2 Bf-109s. Lieutenant Glenn Eagleston got 3 Focke-Wulf 190s. The bombers reached the target, dropped their ordnance, and came home. For the first time since Schweinfurt, an American bomber raid deep into Germany returned without catastrophic losses. The bomber crews noticed. So did the 8th Air Force Command Staff. The Mustang wasn't just good. It was operational proof that the escort problem could be solved. General James Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, saw the opportunity immediately. He'd spent months dealing with the consequences of unescorted bomber raids. Now he had a tool that could protect his bombers anywhere over Europe. He wanted more Mustangs, a lot more. The problem was production. In December 1943, only one fighter group in England flew P-51Bs. North American was ramping up production, but it would take months to build enough Mustangs to re-equip the entire 8th Air Force Fighter Command. Meanwhile, the strategic bombing campaign couldn't wait. The combined bomber offensive, codenamed Operation Point Blank, had a schedule. German fighter production had to be destroyed before D-Day. That meant missions had to be flown now, with whatever aircraft were available. Doolittle made a calculated decision. Mix the escorts, use P-38s and P-47s for the first legs of the mission, shorter range coverage near the coast and over France. Bring the Mustangs in for the deep penetration phase, the part where bombers were most vulnerable. Then layer the short-range fighters back in on the return leg. It wasn't perfect, but it was workable. And it meant the limited number of Mustangs could have maximum impact. March 3, 1944. The first American fighter escort mission to Berlin. The mission everyone said was impossible. 450 miles from England to the German capital. 900 miles round trip, beyond the range of every American fighter except one. The 354th Fighter Group, along with the 357th and 363rd, recently equipped with P-51Bs, launched from English bases before dawn. Each pilot carried 419 gallons of fuel, enough for 7 hours in the air, enough to reach Berlin, fight, and come home. The bomber stream took off an hour later, over 600 B-17s and B-24s, heading east in formations that stretched for miles. The mission profile was exactly what the planners had envisioned. P-47s provided escort over the North Sea and Holland. At the German border, they turned back, fuel exhausted. The Mustangs took over. The Luftwaffe response was massive. Over 160 German fighters intercepted the raid, Bf-109s, W-190s, and twin-engine Bf-1-10 heavy fighters. They came in waves, trying to break the bomber formations before they reached Berlin. The Mustang pilots did something the Germans hadn't seen before. They didn't break off the escort to chase individual fighters. They stayed with the bombers, close escort, making every German attack costly. When Bf-109s tried to dive through the formation, the Mustangs were there. When 4 Lu-190s set up deflection shots on stragglers, the Mustangs intercepted them. The Germans had grown accustomed to having unlimited time to work on American bombers once the short-range escorts turned back. Today, there was no gap. The escorts went all the way. Over Berlin, the flak was intense, but the bomber formations held together. Ordnance dropped on the Erkner ball-bearing plant and the Robert Bosch electrical works. Not a precision strike, cloud cover interfered with aiming, but the psychological impact was enormous. American bombers were over the capital of the Third Reich in broad daylight, and they were protected. The return flight saw more intense combat. German fighters regrouped and hit the bomber stream again over Brandenburg and Magdeburg. The Mustangs fought running battles across northern Germany, expending ammunition and fuel. Several pilots reported their fuel states dropping below comfort levels. But the 85-gallon Fuselage tanks, burned off hours earlier during cruise, had bought them the margin they needed. By the time the formations crossed back into Holland, the Mustangs still had fuel in their wing tanks. They made it home. Losses for the mission: 69 bombers and 11 fighters. Severe, but sustainable. Critically, far lower than Schweinfurt's 26% casualty rate. And the Luftwaffe had lost 83 aircraft, many of them experienced pilots who couldn't be easily replaced. The strategic calculus had shifted. The Mustang had just proven that American bombers could reach any target in Germany with fighter protection. The Luftwaffe could no longer wait out the escorts and ambush undefended bomber streams. They had to fight the entire mission, and fighting the entire mission meant attrition they couldn't afford, this time with better weather and more Mustangs. The 8th Air Force put over 700 heavy bombers in the air, escorted by over 800 fighters, most of them P-51Bs and the newer P-51Ds with bubble canopies. The mission became a massacre, but not for the Americans. The Luftwaffe threw everything at the raid. Over 200 German fighters engaged in what became the largest air battle over Berlin of the war. The Mustang pilots, now familiar with the route and the tactics, ripped through the German formations. Major James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group single-handedly fought off at least 30 German fighters trying to attack a bomber group, earning the Medal of Honor. Lieutenant Colonel James Clark shot down 3 Bf-109s in 15 minutes. The bomber force reached Berlin, hit multiple targets, and returned to England. Luftwaffe losses: over 80 fighters and pilots. American losses: 37 bombers and 17 fighters. The exchange rate was becoming unsustainable for Germany. They were losing experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them, and the Americans were just getting started. Big Week, February 20th to February 25th, 1944. A coordinated series of missions targeting German aircraft production facilities. Regensburg, Leipzig, Augsburg, Stuttgart, Schweinfurt, again. The 8th Air Force, now with substantial numbers of P-51 Mustangs available, launched the offensive they'd been planning since before Schweinfurt. The goal was simple: destroy the Luftwaffe's ability to build fighters, bomb the factories, force the German fighters to defend, and shoot them down in numbers they couldn't replace. The Mustang made it possible. Every mission, regardless of target depth, had full fighter escort. The P-51s went everywhere the bombers went. When the Luftwaffe attempted to concentrate fighters for massive defensive efforts, the Mustangs engaged them. When German fighters tried to conserve their strength and avoid combat, the Mustangs went hunting, striking airfields and destroying aircraft on the ground. By the end of Big Week, the 8th Air Force had flown over 3,000 bomber sorties, dropped nearly 10,000 tons of ordnance on German industry, and claimed over 500 German aircraft destroyed. American losses were significant: 226 bombers and 28 fighters. But the exchange rate was devastating for Germany. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm was bleeding to death. Experienced pilots were gone. Replacement pilots with minimal training were being thrown into combat and killed on their first missions. Aircraft production, though damaged by bombing, wasn't the bottleneck anymore. Pilot attrition was. By April 1944, the 8th Air Force had established air superiority over Germany during daylight hours. German fighters still rose to contest raids, but they were outnumbered, outflown, and operating with inadequate fuel supplies as the oil campaign intensified. The Mustang units were claiming kill ratios of 10-1 or better. It wasn't just the aircraft, it was the operational freedom the aircraft enabled. Bomber formations could fly direct routes instead of evasive patterns designed to minimize time over enemy territory. Bomb runs could be executed with more precision because fighters were suppressing flak positions and driving off interceptors. Most critically, Bomber crews weren't dying at catastrophic rates anymore. The loss rate that had peaked at over 9% per mission in October 1943 dropped to under 4% by spring 1944. That difference represented thousands of airmen who came home. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force had 14 fighter groups. 13 of them flew P-51 Mustangs. The P-47 Thunderbolt, which had started the war as the primary American escort fighter, was being reassigned to ground attack roles. The P-38 Lightning was being phased out of the European theatre entirely. The Mustang had become the dominant fighter not because it was faster or more maneuverable than its competitors, though it was competitive in both categories. It had become dominant because it could go where the war demanded. When bomber commanders looked at a map of Germany and chose targets based on strategic importance rather than fighter escort range, that was the Mustang's victory. When Luftwaffe pilots recognized American fighters over Berlin and understood they'd be fighting all the way home, that was the Mustang's impact. The 85-gallon fuselage tank that pilots hated, that made the aircraft dangerous to fly until it was burned off, that violated every conventional principle of fighter design, that tank represented the margin between mission success and disaster. It was the difference between escort coverage ending at the German border and escort coverage over Berlin. It was why bomber crews lived. The decision to put fuel in the wings instead of the fuselage, made in April 1940 by an engineer who was told it wouldn't work, created the space for that fuselage tank to exist. Without the wing tanks handling the primary fuel load, there would have been no room for the 85 gallons behind the pilot. Without those 85 gallons, the Mustang would have been just another good fighter with insufficient range. The entire chain of causation traced back to Schmued's insistence that wings could carry fuel better than fuselages, a decision that seemed stupid until it became essential. The cost of not having the Mustang earlier was quantifiable. Between August and October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost over 800 bombers in combat. That represented roughly 8,000 airmen killed, wounded, or captured. Many of those losses occurred during unescorted portions of missions, when German fighters had free access to the bomber formations. Schweinfurt alone accounted for 120 bombers and 1,200 men across the two raids in August and October. If the P-51B, with its 85-gallon fuselage tank, had been available in August 1943 instead of December, the strategic bombing campaign would have looked dramatically different. Bomber losses would have been lower. Crew morale wouldn't have cratered after missions like Schweinfurt. The pause in deep penetration raids that lasted from October to February might have been avoided entirely. The question military historians still debate is why the Mustang took so long to reach operational status in the role it was designed to fill. The aircraft existed in April 1942 when the RAF first used it for reconnaissance. The Merlin-powered version proved its capabilities in testing by late 1942. North American was producing P-51Bs by June 1943. Yet the first long-range escort missions didn't happen until December. Part of the delay was bureaucratic. The Army Air Force's procurement system in 1942 and 1943 favoured the P-47 Thunderbolt, which Republic Aviation was producing in large numbers. The P-38 Lightning had powerful advocates, including General Arnold himself. The Mustang was a late arrival to a procurement process that had already committed to other aircraft. Contracts were in place, production lines were running, and changing course meant delays and political complications. Part of the delay was doctrinal. Many senior officers still believed the bomber self-defense concept could work if formations were larger and tactics improved. They saw fighter escorts as supplements, not essentials. Schweinfurt had to happen before that doctrine collapsed entirely, and part of the delay was simply that nobody understood what the Mustang could become until they saw it in combat. Test flight performance data could show speed and range, but operational effectiveness required real missions with real opposition. Once combat units flew the Mustang over Germany and reported back, procurement priorities shifted rapidly. But those months of delay cost lives. The technical innovation that made the Mustang's range possible, the wing-mounted fuel tanks and the rear fuselage expansion tank, represented a different kind of engineering philosophy than what dominated American aircraft design. Most American fighters were designed around engine performance and maneuverability first, with range as a secondary consideration. The P-47 was optimized for high-altitude performance using a massive turbo-supercharged engine. The P-38 was designed for speed and climb rate using twin engines. Both were excellent fighters within their operational envelopes, but neither was designed from the start with strategic range as a primary requirement. Schmued designed the Mustang differently. He started with the understanding that modern warfare required aircraft to operate far from their bases. Fuel capacity wasn't an afterthought. It was a foundational design constraint. Every decision about where to place components, how to route systems, and how to allocate internal volume was made with the knowledge that fuel load directly determined operational capability. The wing tank layout, which seemed unconventional in 1940, became standard practice for post-war fighters. The F-86 Sabre, which Schmued also designed at North American, used wing tanks as its primary fuel storage. So did the F-100 Super Sabre. The Navy's Fate Crusader, the Air Force's F-105 Thunderchief, the 4 Phantom, all incorporated substantial wing fuel capacity in their designs. By the 1960s, putting fuel in the wings wasn't innovative. It was expected, but in 1940, it was radical, enough that Schmued had to fight his own engineering team to implement it. The 85-gallon fuselage tank had a different legacy. Its handling characteristics were dangerous enough that it influenced fighter design philosophy going forward. Post-war fighters with rear fuselage fuel tanks incorporated more sophisticated fuel management systems and better weight distribution to avoid the instability problems the P-51 experienced. The lesson was clear. You could add fuel capacity anywhere in the aircraft, but you had to account for center of gravity shift throughout the entire fuel consumption cycle. The Mustang's success also validated the concept of long-range fighter escort as essential to strategic bombing. Before the Mustang, bomber advocates argued that formations with adequate defensive armament could survive without escorts. The Schweinfurt raids proved that doctrine wrong. After the Mustang, fighter escort became non-negotiable for daylight bombing operations. The Korean War, Vietnam, and every subsequent conflict involving strategic air operations included dedicated fighter escorts. The doctrine born from the Mustang's operational experience became permanent. Edgar Schmued never received the same public recognition as the pilots who flew his aircraft. There's no Medal of Honor for engineering decisions made 4 years before the battles they enable. But the men who flew Mustangs over Germany knew. The 354th Fighter Group, the pioneer Mustang Group, flew over 400 missions with P-51 variants. They claimed over 700 enemy aircraft destroyed. They escorted thousands of bombers to targets across Europe. And they did it in an aircraft that could reach Berlin because one engineer insisted on putting fuel tanks in the wings. By the end of the war in Europe, May 1945, the 8th Air Force had flown over 200,000 bomber sorties. Luftwaffe fighter opposition had collapsed, not because German aircraft were inferior, though by 1945 they were facing fuel shortages that grounded much of their air force, but because the operational mathematics had become impossible. The Germans couldn't train pilots fast enough to replace combat losses. They couldn't defend their industry effectively when American bombers could strike anywhere with impunity. And they couldn't contest air superiority when P-51 Mustangs were flying patrols over Berlin. The strategic bombing campaign's effectiveness remains debated among historians. Some argue it diverted resources that could have been used elsewhere. Others point to the destruction of German oil production and transportation infrastructure as war-winning contributions. But one aspect isn't debatable. Without fighter escorts capable of protecting bombers throughout their missions, the campaign couldn't have continued. The casualty rates in late 1943 were unsustainable. The pause after Schweinfurt proved that. What the Mustang provided wasn't just tactical air superiority, it was operational feasibility, the ability to execute the mission at all. The question that haunts the analysis is what would have happened if the Escort problem hadn't been solved, if no fighter with sufficient range had been available. The answer involves abandoning daylight precision bombing, which means abandoning the doctrine that justified an independent air force. It means switching to British-style night area bombing, which was less accurate and more controversial. It means accepting that strategic bombing of German industry couldn't be executed as planned, which potentially extends the war by months or years. The Mustang didn't win World War II. No single weapon system does that. But it enabled a strategy that might otherwise have failed. And that enabling capability traced directly back to decisions made in a California engineering office in spring 1940, when one designer looked at conventional fuel tank placement and said, "We can do this better." The production numbers tell part of the story. North American built over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs during the war, more than any other American fighter except the P-47. But production numbers only matter if the aircraft performs its mission. The Mustang did, repeatedly, at ranges other fighters couldn't match. The operational statistics tell the rest. From December 1943 through May 1945, Mustang-equipped fighter groups in Europe claimed over 5,000 German aircraft destroyed in air combat. They escorted bomber missions that dropped over 600,000 tons of ordnance on German targets. And bomber loss rates dropped from the 9% catastrophe of October 1943 to under 2% by late 1944. Those are the numbers that matter. Not because they represent American technological superiority. The German jets entering service in 1945 were superior aircraft, but because they represent operational effectiveness, the ability to be where you're needed, when you're needed, with enough fuel to fight and return. The P-51's combat service continued after World War II. Mustangs flew in the Korean War, primarily in ground attack roles, but also in air-to-air combat against North Korean Yak-9s and early Soviet jets. The last Mustang retired from U.S. military service in 1957, 12 years after the war ended. Some remained in service with foreign air forces through the 1980s. That longevity speaks to the fundamental soundness of Schmued's design. An aircraft built in 1940 remained operationally relevant through 4 decades of aviation advancement. Modern fighter doctrine still reflects lessons learned from the Mustang's operational experience. Combat radius is a primary specification for every fighter aircraft. The 15 Eagle has a combat radius of over 1,000 miles. The F-35 has an operational range exceeding 1,300 miles. Those capabilities exist because military planners learned from World War II that tactical superiority without strategic reach is insufficient. You have to be able to escort the bombers all the way. The technical solution that enabled that reach, distributing fuel throughout the aircraft structure in wings, fuselage, and conformal tanks, traces its lineage directly to Schmued's wing tank innovation. It's not the same implementation. Modern fighters use fuel as a structural element in ways the Mustang never did, but the principle remains. Don't concentrate fuel in one location. Distribute it, manage it carefully, and design the aircraft's weight distribution to accommodate fuel state changes throughout the mission. That's engineering doctrine now. It was radical innovation in 1940. There's a broader lesson about how innovation happens during wartime. The Mustang wasn't developed through a methodical research program that evaluated all possible designs and selected the optimal solution. It was developed under desperate time pressure by an engineer who made educated guesses about what would work and committed to those decisions before they could be fully validated. Some of those guesses were wrong. The Allison engine proved inadequate and had to be replaced. The original 4-gun armament was insufficient and was upgraded to 6 guns. The canopy design was mediocre and was replaced with a bubble canopy in later variants. But the fundamental airframe design, including the fuel system layout, was sound enough that it could accommodate all those changes without requiring a complete redesign. That's the mark of genuinely good engineering, not perfection, but adaptability. Building in enough margin that mistakes can be corrected and improvements can be incorporated without starting over. Schmued built that margin into the Mustang, possibly without fully realizing how critical it would become. The space for the 85-gallon fuselage tank existed because he'd freed up fuselage volume by moving fuel to the wings. That space didn't have to exist. If he'd made different choices in 1940, if he'd followed conventional practice and used fuselage tanks, that margin wouldn't have been there in 1943 when Army Air Forces desperately needed it. The timing matters. If the Mustang had been designed in 1943, after the Escort problem became obvious, engineers would have intentionally created space for additional fuel capacity. But the Mustang was designed in 1940, before anyone understood that strategic bombing would require fighter escorts with ranges exceeding 1,000 miles. Schmued created the capability before the requirement was known. That's not foresight. It's good design practice creating options you might need later. The men who flew the missions over Germany didn't think about engineering, margins, or fuel system layouts. They thought about survival, about protecting the bomber crews who called them little friends, about making it home after 7 hours in the cockpit at 25,000 feet. But their survival depended on those engineering decisions made years earlier. The wing tanks that gave them base range, the fuselage tank that extended that range despite its handling problems, the fuel management procedures that kept them alive when the rear tank was full. Aviation history remembers the pilots, Chuck Yeager, who scored 11.5 kills flying Mustangs, John Voll, who shot down 21 German aircraft, the Tuskegee Airmen, who flew P-51Cs and P-51Ds with the 15th Air Force and never lost a bomber under their escort to enemy fighters. Those men earned their recognition, but the aircraft that made their achievements possible came from engineering decisions that don't make headlines, from a choice about where to put fuel tanks made by a designer who understood that range would matter more than anyone realized. Schmued died in 1985, 45 years after designing the Mustang. In interviews later in life, he was characteristically modest about his work. He saw the Mustang as a product of its time, shaped by the constraints and requirements of wartime development. He acknowledged the contributions of dozens of other engineers, the test pilots who flew prototypes, the production workers who built the aircraft. He downplayed the individual genius narrative, but the decision to use wing-mounted fuel tanks was his. The commitment to that design over internal objections was his, and the operational capability that decision enabled was the foundation everything else built on. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.